is often framed as just a computational problem, not a labor management problem. Whoops. Okay. So Herbert Marcuse, a couple of quick points. Obviously, he offered a critique of commodification, and these GAFAM companies are at the forefront of commodifying various aspects of social life. He talked about the dialectic between technological domination and human values, which is essential when we talk about algorithms and AI. Also, technical systems as the expression of enlightenment, of rationality, of calculation, calculability, new heuristics of algorithms, and so on. And also as tools for global dominance and control. If you look at the top 5 companies, the GAFAM, and this was just from last week, they had 3.6 trillion joint market capitalization. It was in July, it was 4.1, so it goes up and down, of course. But it fills a lot of the kind of very superficial journalistic reports on what's going on with the artificial intelligence and so on. And I will explain financialization in more detail. But here are basically different software teams within these companies. So Google has a Google AI. Apple is lagging a bit behind because they're developing hardware mostly, but they do have a machine learning and AI strategy team. Facebook has an AI research, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft AI, and so on. So the key point, again, AI captures the imagination of the general public and shifts attention away from the issues of capital, labor, and political economy. So I will take a closer look at research and development expenses within these companies, which form the productive base for developing technical systems. Also, I will look at stock compensations, so ways in which financialization plays a role in attracting highly skilled labor and offering compensations and bonuses for highly skilled software engineers, stock buybacks, and also some machine learning initiatives to finish it off. So when you look at their research and development expenses of all of the 5 companies between 2005 and 2017, we think of these GAFAM companies as being really highly innovative tech companies at the forefront of technological development. Within economy, or at least within certain strands of heterodox economy, authors would argue that if a company spends 10% or more of their yearly revenue on developing new services through research and development, they are considered an innovative company. Apple here is well below 5% for the entire period. It's interesting to see also Amazon, which is of course the major retailer, only started investing in research and development roughly around 2013 and 14 when they started developing their cloud computing services and so on. The only 2 companies basically that are really consistent are Google and Microsoft, above 10%, and Facebook is very erratic. It goes up and down depending on the development of various products. And recently, I think this could be attributed, the rise since 2013, it could be attributed to different ways in which it tries to improve the services with regard to surveillance, privacy, and other issues. Of course, research and development is one thing, and these numbers are basically the numbers on the salaries that highly skilled labor gets and the amount of money that goes into development of their products. Another way of using financialization in the development of these companies is stock-based compensation. So these workers get really high salaries, and they also get stock options. But the thing is, they can't, most of the time when they enter the company, they can't exercise their stock options. So they have a vested period of a couple of years, which means that they can exercise their stock and get the bonus 3 or 4 years after they are hired, which means that their interests are really closely aligned with the with the development of the company and with the performance of the stock, of the company. So financialization has one kind of, it's connected with the production of these services in this way in particular. So most of the companies are relatively stable. Facebook, again, is very erratic, depending on different time periods in which it kind of, workers exercise their stock options. But most of the other companies are relatively stable, with Google, based on these stock options, seems to be the most at least for computer scientists and engineers, the best company to work in. Of course, there are other functions of financialization as well, but I won't go into them. Now, the way in which they align their interests, they can exercise their stock options after a couple of years, so they constantly monitor what are the earnings per share for these companies. And Google has the highest earning per share, although it dipped in 2016 and 17, probably because of the investigations by the European Commission and the fines and so on. So it was fluctuating, but it had different strategies of compensating for the drop in earnings per share. It's also a way of setting corporate goals. So if you have a corporate goal of having a certain earning per share in a fiscal year, most of the work or most of the investments will be, or most of the management energy will be invested in reaching the earning per share, not necessarily investing in research and development. This is also interesting. Dividend payouts are dividends paid on ownership of stock. So if you own stock, if the earning per share goes up, you get a certain dividend just based on the number of stocks that you own. Google, Facebook, and Amazon don't have a dividend payout strategy yet, so they're still trying to control the distribution of profit to shareholders. But the oldest companies, Apple and Microsoft, have been paying dividends for a long time. What is interesting here is that after Steve Jobs died in 2012, and after new management came in and started reallocating resources in a different way, they started a dividend payout strategy. So that means that basically those people who are shareholders and who have the least interest and who have spent the smallest amount of time in developing products and services actually get the highest benefits and highest rewards in this regard. When you look at stock buybacks, now this is a very kind of dirty Wall Street way of making money based on financial fluctuations. It basically means that, so the stock price is based on demand and supply, obviously, supply and demand. So if a stock price is stagnant, the company will announce that it will buy its own stock, thus removing a large quantity of stocks from the market, which creates higher demand, which beefs up the price. Now, the problem with that is that you, or at least the general public, never knows when a stock buyback policy will kick in. So they announce we will buy billions of dollars of our own stock, but they don't say when they will do it. So only the insiders, the management of the company, the top tier management really has the information on when the stock buybacks will happen. And this creates profit for people who sell shares at a specific point in time. So if you're just a regular shareholder, whoever that might be, in New York or wherever, and if you want to sell your stock and you think that the stock buyback policy is happening, you really can't tell. So you're just left with a casino capitalism, basically, and just a roulette that doesn't tell you how and when you can make money from stock. So here you can see that basically Amazon, Amazon and Facebook really don't have a stock buyback policy. Microsoft has been buying back its own stock for a long time, which means that it's catering to its own shareholders, to investors. Again, to people who have no interest in developing products and services. They just have interest in profit making. Again, after Steve Jobs died, massive stock buybacks, $44 billion in 2014 for Apple. So just making money for the shareholders. And it's interesting that Google, compared to Apple, in a very shy manner, started doing stock buybacks. Of course, once the entire European Commission and regulatory kind of fight back started, they started buying back their own share to keep the earnings per share high in order to keep the trust from the shareholders. Okay, so obviously there's a symbiotic relation between financialization and the production of digital services, yet Of course, financial speculation is a highly risky business. The current GAFAM oligopoly, and Google holds 90% of the web search market share in European Economic Area countries, it was not always as certain and undeniable. And I thank Janez for introducing a historical perspective of relativizing these technological developments. It's interesting that Google's initial public offering, so when they started trading with their own stock in 2004, was a complete fiasco. Now Google has, the price of Google shares is around $1,000 per share. When they did their initial public offering in 2004, they were targeting to sell a certain amount of shares at a price between $120 and $130. They ended up trading with $85, so it was widely considered a complete fiasco. Of course, it went up afterwards. The reason for it is that after the dot-com crash in 2000 and 2001, it was very difficult to gain investors' trust in buying stock and investing their own capital in these types of services. And of course, they were competing with Yahoo, with Microsoft services, they were competing with traditional media to attract advertising revenue and so on. So these are stages of Google's company development, and I've been focusing on Google the most in the last couple of years. But I won't go too deeply into this. Roughly, we can say that financialization really helped the company establish an or start a rampant international expansion, which can be called, of course, a very specific type of new digital imperialism in a way. So post-IPO growth and expansion between 2005 and 2008, they were trying to develop their services, establish contracts with different companies that they were cooperating with. Then between 2009 and 2013, this was the benchmark period because they bought Motorola at that time for around 13 or somewhere under $13 billion, which allowed them to expand into the mobile market, mobile telephone market. So they still have an even higher share on web search on mobile phones or a higher share on mobile phones than they have on desktop computers. And after 2014 and 2017, a lot of legal struggles and regulatory scrutiny. They were fined several billions of euros in the last couple of years by the European Commission because of their antitrust behavior. So the point of this is, again, to view these technical systems in a very historical perspective and not view them as a given, as a monopoly that cannot be challenged. And I think this is, again, why Marcuse kicks in, because he talked about one-dimensionality as a way of, rooting out all of the possible alternatives. So looking back in history and analyzing labor and different aspects of the political economy of these companies helps us to see that these companies are in fact really fragile, despite the market share and huge power that they own. What is interesting when we talk about artificial intelligence in their official audited market reports, the term artificial intelligence only appeared as a business description, so they describe what they do in these reports only in 2016. But they stated kind of they started a historical revisionism and stated that machine learning and artificial intelligence are driving many of our latest innovations within Google. Our investments in machine learning over a decade have enabled us, so we've always been doing our artificial intelligence. But before they called it computational, science, machine learning, blah, blah, all these terms that weren't really sexy in a way, or they at least didn't attract the investors or keep the investor confidence close with the company as they are trying to do now. But when we talk about machine learning and when we talk about Google, obviously it's dominating global markets worldwide. And search algorithms have a problem of finding relevant information in different languages and different contexts because there are different cultural nuances, contextual specificities, and so on. So if you look at the Google software engineer, they have a salary up to $300,000, at least according to Glassdoor estimates, plus stock awards and compensations that I mentioned before. But also Google has been, and I've read reports from as early as 2005 and 2006, they used what is called, in different contexts within different companies, so-called web search evaluators, which are people who are hired via third-party companies such as Lionbridge, App, and LeapForce, and they are paid a minimum wage of around 13, 14 bucks per hour in the US, which adds up to a maximum of 14K a year, and that's almost impossible to reach because you have tasks and people compete for different tasks, which means that you can't get up to 20 hours a week most of the time. But these people try to figure out if the search algorithm is indeed finding what the people wanted to search on the internet. It's based on a very specific and also very fragile definition of search utility and relevance. It depends on contextual factors and so on. So if a person types in an abbreviation, it can mean something, MSUM, can mean something completely different, obviously, in Croatia, depending on the location. It can mean something completely different in the US. So they hire these people through these companies to perform machine learning, yet it's framed as a computational problem. It's framed as artificial intelligence. We're teaching machines to figure out and to provide the best search results. Now, of course, I mean, can you put a technological fix on cultural nuance and cultural differences? I really don't think so, but at least Google is claiming that they can. So this is one of the companies, and Lionbridge, that they work with closely, and they state, this is very interesting, effective business search requires a human touch that a technology-only approach cannot provide. Lionbridge helps you navigate the sea of big data and make it more usable for your business and your customers. So this is Lionbridge, the third-party company. Google would never say that they need a human touch to develop AI and algorithms. All right, so I think that we can conclude again by drawing on Marcuse and some recent developments such as financialization, that algorithms and AI should be viewed in a very material perspective. There is a key role of financial capital and product development, especially with stock compensations for highly skilled labor, and also international expansion in different markets. There is exploitation and global inequalities going on at the same time, with the global dominance and control of data flows, specifically by Google. And again, drawing on Marcuse, there's a very specific dialectic between technological domination and human values at play when we talk about search algorithms and artificial intelligence more broadly. So digital one-dimensionality, by accumulating capital, humans, and data, Google acts as a gatekeeper for much of the information on the web, creating a one-dimensional digital society. And in this sense, we can view AI systems as tools for global dominance and control. So, thank you.
Thank you. So maybe I'll start with a question, and then I'll give the floor to others to pose questions as well. Two very interesting presentations that, and I would like to find some parallels, perhaps because Yanis was very, in a long historical, as an ALE school would probably say, a very, basically jumping through time, and Paško was basically looking at the last 20 years. And what perhaps caught my attention the most was that you both, at least to an extent, mentioned monopolies over knowledge, or your presentations at least partially also touch on this issue of monopolies over knowledge. And of course, this is usually interpreted as something of the past, right? Monopolies over knowledge were basically, I don't know, people didn't know how to write, and those that did know how to write tried to, of course, keep that knowledge for themselves, so they would stay the elite, right, or stay in power and so on. And of course, today these companies present themselves, at least they are not in fact such, but they present themselves as those that bring knowledge to everyone. But when we look at, I don't know, who owns, I don't know, all of the information, all of the big data, we basically end up with these companies. And you mentioned that, of course, Paško, you mentioned that there were possible disruptions, right? It wasn't necessary that Google would be the company. But the question is it possible that these monopolies over knowledge, at least in digital environment, would, that another company, I don't know, would just basically come along? Because these companies now have so much of information that it's very difficult to basically compete with them, right? It's very difficult to get into that market. And this also, I think, at least partially touches on what you were saying. These companies, of course, develop what you call specialized. If I remember correctly, the specialized artificial intelligence. But the question would be, is it possible, and these are of course algorithms, right? They develop algorithms basically. Is it possible that there would be a qualitative jump where these specialized intelligence basically would jump into another qualitative dimension where a general artificial intelligence would develop? And of course, nobody really focuses on this, but these would be the companies, right, that would have this knowledge, this control over the technological environment, not normal human beings or whatever way you call it. There are huge inequalities here, right? So this is just something to start a discussion maybe, and I don't know, maybe first Pashko and then Yanis, if you have any comments on what
Well, considering the monopoles, there's an interesting the monopoly on knowledge. There's an interesting theory. I read it in the Fisher's Valley of Genius, speaking about the Silicon Valley, and it says that Peter Thiel, I think he was one of the founders of PayPal and lecturing on Stanford, said that to his students that they have to create monopoles. It's the way to earn huge amounts of money with your specialized function, either as AI or some other technological wizardry, and it enables you to accumulate gigantic quantities of capital and also sell it very successfully, as Pashko just presented. So considering monopolies, we're definitely not over with them, but there is a phenomenon also here. We have to take into consideration the recent situation with Cambridge Analytica. They were given data by Facebook.
Yeah, but they paid for it.
Exactly, but the thing is, it's obviously for sale.
Mm-hmm.
So our meta knowledge we produce is obviously meant to be sold. So our behavior is actually a product. Mm-hmm. So it's obvious that they do share. And then the second, I think, excellent example would be a bit more obscure firm called Palantir, if you ever heard about it. They are very, very intelligent, considering the analysis of meta-knowledge, going from your internet signature to your telephone signature and so on. They were the ones that, for instance, made the big presentation of who occupies what in Syria and how the information is flowing from and so on. And I would say they are not that close, but they do tend to form this monopolies, as we just found out, and they do sell them very effectively. Now, and I would compare that to, let's say, ancient monopolies on knowledge, because in the past, the democratization of knowledge is a new idea, relatively, considering the human past of, let's say, 6,000 years of written material. So it's not obvious that the things, the conclusions they produce are democratic. There's nothing about it saying that. It's democratic if you're a shareholder. It's a shareholder democracy, as let's say in this context. So I would say that they do collaborate, they do work together, and the product is the thing that has end value, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, along with Marcuse, I also use a lot of Baran and Sweezy monopoly capital theory for several reasons. They were contemporaries of Marcuse. Marcuse talked about monopolies, but he talked about the social and psychological implications of it and the ideology of advanced industrial society. Baran and Sweezy talked about political and economic processes of concentration and centralization of capital, drawing on Marx. And they also had some chapters on social implications as well, but I think that the biggest value comes from their political and economic perspective. After Baran and Sweezy, because they wrote that in 1962, there's a huge monthly review school of thought dealing with issues of monopolies and financialization since the 1970s. So within that school, it's a tendency of capitalism is to create stagnation in production sector, and financialization is a way of boosting profits or of capital escaping the weakly profitable productive sector. Of course, when we talk about GAFAM, it's very difficult to see what's production, what's finance, because they are very productive and they are very profitable, even in their own non-financialized economic area, if you will, like the basic productive sector, because they generated, Alphabet generated $110 billion of revenue in 2017. So it's not like they're not productive. I think that the key point is the social inequalities, because you have engineers and computer scientists who have a very specific vision of society. And they really think like they're really fed by these myths of artificial intelligence, science fiction movies, and so on, that they're creating benefits for society. And obviously it's creating vast unintended consequences. I don't think that they're like evil, James Bond villains, plotting to, maybe, maybe, but sometimes at home, in their private quarters. But the key is really the new types of social inequalities that are being created through digital technologies. And I mean, the question about alternatives is Marcuse was, again, very specific within the Frankfurt School, because he wasn't, as cultural studies people would say, as pessimistic as Adorno and Horkheimer, because he talked about possibilities of creating alternatives. He went into arts and philosophy as a way of doing that. I'm not sure how to approach, how to demonopolize these companies. Microsoft was targeted for antitrust behavior like, 10 years ago, I think, or something like that. They're still up there with the top 5 companies. So I'm not sure what that created. It just kind of silenced the public, I think. Now, yeah, I can't remember what was the issue. Yeah, but they broke it up into several smaller companies, and basically they just silenced the public. Now there's a huge public outrage. These companies affected political processes, elections, and so on, and of course the politicians have to think about ways of mending that. Nick Cernacek talked about nationalizing Google. It's a very kind of leftist, let's go way of thinking. I mean, I would support that, but technically, tactically, I can't envision any way in which we could approach Trump and say, look, man, you need to... We don't have any legitimacy anyway. If we talk about democracy, it's still within the national quarters. Capital is transnational. Yeah, maybe. But I like some of the initiatives by the European Commission of taxing these companies, because they generate huge revenues in different countries, Slovenia, Croatia, all over the world, of course, without having any corporate presence there. Of course, they do it because they don't want to spend money and they want to have high profit rates. But they do generate revenue from these countries. So the proposal from the European Commission is to tax them based on the significant digital presence that they have, the amount of money that they generate in national markets. Whether that's going to help, I don't think so. It's just going to be.
You're talking about link tax, right? Also about link tax.
Not the link tax. It's the advertising tax. It's the tax directive.
But what about what's your opinion on the link tax? Because it's also an interesting initiative. I don't think it's thought through really well, but it is something that could help, for example, news media to at least get back some revenue. But maybe I'm jumping a little, but what you mentioned, for example, is exactly what I was in a more longer run, of course, aiming at. It's a question of democracy as well, right? It's a question of if there's basically 5 companies in the world that have monopoly over most of the information, most of the how we access data, what information we find, and it's up for sale, right? If you have enough money, like in Brazil now, I think that Bolsonaro more or less won elections also because of WhatsApp. They really targeted through WhatsApp people with specific targeted advertising, which was really curated to fit their interests, so they really could micro-target, right? But it's a question of democracy as well, right? It's a question of how to, I don't know, in 20 years, if you imagine there will be 5 companies, it's very difficult to imagine a society that can be considered democratic in that sense. And of course, the suggestion of Nick Cernicek, I'm not really sure about nationalization as well, because, I don't know, China isn't really a great example of a country where I'd like to live. But, of course, it's also just a thought. So maybe if you have any other comments, or maybe I can open up the debate and we get some other...
Just on that, it was one of my ideas to emphasize the importance of the monopoly of knowledge as a social disruptive technology. And definitely with those 5 companies, we do have a situation where in their hands, such quantity of information is gathered that they do constitute a danger of some kind to democracy. Although for a cynical view would say that there's nothing left to disrupt actually, because everything is already gone. There's a question of the viewpoint. I mean, and consider it from a different angle. It was the same thing in 19th century with the earliest monopoles deriving from the electric power, from the railroad and so on, in for instance, US or in Great Britain. So we are faced with the same dilemma all over again. The thing is only if we can force the states, the political system, to make a frame, a legislature frame that can limit the power of those companies. I don't consider it possible for them to nationalize, definitely. It's an utopical idea. And on the other side, what would we gain by handling it over to a panel of politically named individuals? I think nothing. Nothing important would change. Perhaps there's a different, a kind of a ludist view presented by Lanier, who says that there's no problem, you just don't need to use it. Just don't put your digital trace using Facebook. Use, I don't know, Yandex, the Russian search engine, instead of Google. So you will disperse your trace around, you know. So there are modes that can disrupt their way of working. And perhaps that's also some kind of digital guerrilla possible that can lower their function.
Okay, thanks. So do you want to... I think we have a question there and there. Unfortunately, we only have, I think, 5 minutes left. So if you could make it short, that would be stupendous.
I'll make it super short. I'll make it a comment instead of a question, so you don't have to talk at all. Just 2 small things. One is to add to your depiction. There is this recent book by this important Chinese venture capitalist, Kai-Fu Lee, who used to be director of Google China. And his recent book describes exactly the ways in which China is effectively competing with the BAT, the Baidu, Alibaba and Tencent are already in market cap completely comparable, but he also is pointing at very, very indicative, very, very high quality pieces of inference to think in a new way about this. So just to add a little nuance or a layer to what you were describing, because our perception of these 5 companies as being genuinely global monopolies is possibly skewed, or at least is something that is just now being attacked, which brings me to this second part of the first comment. We are mixing apples and oranges, or not making a clear distinction between those two animals when we talk of state and non-state actors in this field, because we are describing money and power as if they were the same thing. It just so happens that right now you have global, let's say, capitalist entities playing the game, but also you have state actors completely following the hype. I completely agree this is a hype thing, but you just have to. And what is now going on is that you have main European countries coming up with AI strategies. The German one just came out last week. French one is several months old. Pashko, you and I are now involved in this Council of Europe business, same ideas of articulate, exactly, fixing the world. But the trick is, while these state actors are competing in generating AI strategies, they are not involved in the aroma of democracy, the flavor of democracy we are going to be enjoying in the following period, but they are instead involved in a good old classic geopolitical power game and nothing else at all. And regardless of the freshness of the rhetoric air fresheners used by companies and states at given time, it's not changing anything in substance. And now this brings me to the second little part. I'm trying to really be brief here. All of this is diagnostics. We are just saying how things are and then adding details to make a picture better, higher resolution, more plastic in 3D. The question is of action, and then who is doing the doing? Who is going to be performing that action? And here, because we're in an art museum, it reminds me that there is this whole arena of critical media art that I happen to belong to with a larger portion of my body and mind. And I just wanted to ask you guys maybe if you have any other suggestion. What are these open spaces for debate and maybe even action regarding all of this? Or we're going to stick to articulating good diagnoses till we die?
No, we won't use Facebook. I don't.
Okay, so
I mean, that's the most concrete way of action possible. You just don't use the tools that enable all of this.
it's individual action.
Yeah, and it can be a group action. I mean, Jaron Lanier is very, very specific about that.
Talk inside the power stick, please.
Yeah.
This is going to Moscow.
I don't think it's working. Yeah. So it was a fake microphone. You got a fake microphone. So I'm not really sure about these individual actions, to be honest, but that's just my opinion. I find it fascinating that the public service media never really went into that. I'm not saying that they would be good in doing it, but they never really even thought about doing something, I don't know, social media or something like that.
Uh-huh. I don't think we'll really have time for this, but here it goes. So it's a bit early for me, but if I understood you correctly, you described this sort of attitude towards artificial intelligence as something, potentially noxious. In Epimethean terms, that is, you compared it specifically to the famous, Socrates speech about writing. Oh, you weren't thinking about that specific example because
historians always derive our knowledge from historical sources, and my source was Caesar, his komentarji in the Belogari. That is where he expresses the dilemma that Celtic society had, and what is the phenomenon here is that because they didn't use the writing system, we literally have nothing left. We only have their personal names, we have the names of the towns, the rivers, and so on. So for me, the big question is, will the civilization survive without artificial intelligence? For me, the question of power and so on is not that much relevant. For me, that's a fact that it's a power system. The question is only how will we react, and what will be the legal mainframe with which we can work.
No, I only mention this because this particular question, using this particular example, has a long, notorious and famous history in philosophy. And the thing is, there's I think, a large difference between the example of writing and the paranoia regarding artificial intelligence. Because if you take the example of writing, the whole story as it is interpreted from Plato through Derrida and so on, is the idea of delegation of human activity to some external contraption device. Yeah, but the thing is that while, let's call it the means of an activity is delegated, the ability to be the goal setter still remains with the person itself. What I think a large part of the paranoia regarding artificial intelligence is precisely the idea that goal setting activity is sort of given away to self-learning algorithms and so on. So the idea would be that this paranoia stems also because this ultimately, you know, goes against a lot of things we perceive as